March 1998, Toronto wakes to a nightmare. Donna Ogilvie, 24 years old and 4 months pregnant, is found strangled in a parking lot near Maple Leaf Park. She had dreams of motherhood, of a better life. Instead, she became a headline that would haunt a city for decades. Police collect DNA from the scene, but the technology can't identify the killer. Days turn to weeks. Weeks turn to years. The case goes cold. Her family never stops believing, never stops waiting. They light candles every year on her birthday, whispering the same prayer, "Please God, let there be justice." 27 years pass. Then, in February 2025, at Pearson International Airport, officers surround a man boarding a flight. Ronald Ackerman. The DNA finally has a name. After nearly 3 decades of silence, one question shatters the quiet. How does a killer hide in plain sight for 27 years? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. Maple Leaf Park sat quiet in the early light, its pathways empty, its trees still winter bare. The parking lot off Dufferin Street should have been deserted, forgotten, a place people passed through without notice. But on this morning, in March 1998, it became something else entirely. Police tape stretched across the entrance, yellow and stark against the pale concrete. Cruisers lined the street, their lights cutting through the fog in rhythmic pulses. Officers moved with purpose, their voices low, their expressions tight. And in the center of it all, beneath a tarp that fluttered in the wind, lay the body of a young woman, Donna Ogilvie, 24 years old, 4 months pregnant, strangled. The word moved through the crowd of onlookers like a shockwave, whispered from one person to the next. She had been found by a jogger just after dawn, her body cold, her hands still clutching at nothing. The scene was brutal in its simplicity. No weapons, no signs of a struggle that spread beyond that single, terrible moment. Just a life ended in the dark, in a place where no one should have died. Detective Sergeant Steve Smith arrived before the sun fully broke the horizon. He was young then, barely 2 years out of the academy, still learning how to read a crime scene without letting his emotions show. But standing there, looking at the tarp, feeling the weight of what lay beneath it, he felt something crack inside him. This wasn't just another case. This was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's future, stolen before it could begin. The forensics team worked methodically, photographing every angle, collecting every fragment of evidence. They found DNA on her clothing, a trace of someone else, someone who had been close enough to kill. In 1998, DNA technology was still in its early stages. They could collect it, preserve it, store it, but matching it to a name? That required a database, a comparison, a stroke of luck. And luck, as it turned out, was nowhere to be found. By midday, the media had descended. News vans lined the street, reporters jostling for position, cameras trained on the park entrance. The headline wrote itself, "Pregnant woman found dead near Maple Leaf Park." It screamed from every television screen, every newspaper, front page. Toronto, a city that prided itself on safety, on civility, suddenly felt smaller, more vulnerable. If it could happen here, it could happen anywhere. Donna's family learned of her death in the worst way imaginable. A knock on the door. 2 officers, their faces solemn, their words carefully chosen but devastating nonetheless. Mrs. Ogilvie collapsed into her husband's arms, her scream echoing through the small house on Bathurst Street. Donna's younger sister, barely 16, stood frozen in the hallway, her mind refusing to accept what her ears were hearing. Donna, her Donna, the one who always knew what to say, who always had a smile ready, who was finally going to have the baby she'd dreamed about for years. The investigation began immediately. Detective Smith and his team canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on every door within a half-mile radius of Maple Leaf Park. Someone must have seen something. Someone must have heard something, but the answers came back empty. Vague, useless. A woman remembered seeing Donna walking with a man the night before, but she couldn't describe him. Average height, maybe. Dark jacket, she thought. Nothing that could narrow the search. They pulled surveillance footage from nearby businesses, but the cameras were old, the images grainy and unclear. They interviewed Donna's friends, her co-workers, anyone who might have known who she was with that night. The DNA sample sat in a lab, carefully preserved, waiting for technology to catch up. But as the days turned into weeks, the leads dried up, the phones stopped ringing, the tips stopped coming in, the media moved on to other stories. The public's attention shifted. But for Donna's family, time stood still. Mrs. Ogilvie couldn't sleep in her own bed anymore. She spent her nights in Donna's room, surrounded by her daughter's things, holding her clothes, breathing in the faint scent of her perfume. Every morning, she woke up hoping it had been a nightmare. Every morning, reality crushed her again. Donna had been a dreamer, not in the impractical sense, but in the way that all good people dream of a life filled with love, with purpose, with meaning. She worked at a small bakery on Queen Street, decorating cakes and chatting with customers who came back week after week just to see her smile. She had a gift for making people feel seen, for remembering their stories, their children's names, their small victories, and quiet struggles. When she found out she was pregnant, she cried for an hour straight, happy tears, the kind that come from a place so deep you didn't know it existed. She called her mother first, her voice shaking with joy. "I'm going to be a mom," she said, and Mrs. Ogilvie, hearing the pure happiness in her daughter's voice, felt her own heart swell with pride. Donna had waited so long for this. She deserved it. She started planning immediately. She bought books about pregnancy, about parenting, about how to create a home filled with warmth and safety. She painted the small room in her apartment, a soft, yellow, gender-neutral, perfect. She bought a crib second-hand and spent an entire weekend assembling it, laughing at her own fumbling attempts to follow the instructions. Her sister came over to help, and they sat on the floor surrounded by screws and wooden slats, imagining the baby who would sleep there soon. But Donna never got to see that crib used. She never got to hold her baby, to count tiny fingers and toes, to whisper promises into soft newborn ears. All of that was taken from her on a cold March night, in a parking lot that should have been safe, by someone who walked away and disappeared into the shadows. Her family held a vigil 2 weeks after her death. Hundreds of people came, strangers and friends alike, holding candles and flowers, their faces etched with grief and anger. Mrs. Ogilvie stood at the front, her voice breaking as she spoke. "My daughter was a light," she said, "and we will not let that light be forgotten. We will not stop until we find the person who did this. We will not rest." The crowd murmured their agreement, their candles flickering in the evening breeze. But even as they pledged their support, even as they promised to remember, a quiet truth settled over them all. Cases like this often went unsolved. Killers sometimes got away. Justice, for all its power, sometimes failed. As the months passed, the investigation stalled. Detective Smith continued to review the file, to chase down every lead, no matter how thin. But there was only so much he could do. The DNA evidence was solid, preserved perfectly, but without a match in the database. It was just a piece of a puzzle, with no picture to guide them. They questioned dozens of men who had been in the area that night, but none of them fit. None of them had a motive. None of them could be tied to Donna in any meaningful way. By 1999, the case was unofficially cold. New detectives took over, fresh eyes reviewing old evidence, but they reached the same dead ends. The file was thick with reports, interviews, forensic analyses, all of it meticulous, all of it thorough, and all of it leading nowhere. The box was labeled Unsolved and placed on a shelf in the cold case unit, where it sat alongside dozens of others, each one representing a life, a family, a wound that refused to heal. But Mrs. Ogilvie refused to let Donna be forgotten. Every year on her birthday, she organized a vigil at Maple Leaf Park. Every year, fewer people came, but she didn't care. She stood there with her remaining children, with a few loyal friends, and she lit candles and she spoke Donna's name. She told stories about her daughter, about her kindness, her laugh, her dreams. And every year, she ended with the same plea: "Please, if you know something, say something. Help us find peace." The years became a blur. 2000, 2005, 2010. The world changed around them. Technology advanced. DNA databases expanded, but still, no match. Detective Smith, now a sergeant, never forgot Donna's case. He kept a photo of her on his desk, a reminder of the promise he'd made to himself that cold March morning. He would not give up. Even if it took the rest of his career, he would find the person who killed her. In 2015, the Toronto Police Service established a dedicated cold case unit, equipped with new resources and new technology. Smith was assigned to lead it. One of the first files he pulled was Donna's. He had the DNA retested using updated methods, hoping for a breakthrough. The profile was clearer now, more detailed, but still, it didn't match anyone in the system. The killer, whoever he was, had no criminal record, or if he did, it was from before DNA collection became standard procedure. Smith sat in his office late one night. The file spread across his desk, and he felt the old frustration rise in his chest. How could someone do this and just vanish? How could they live a normal life, go to work, maybe even have a family, while Donna's family lived in perpetual grief? The injustice of it gnawed at him, but he pushed it down. Emotion wouldn't solve this case. Patience would. Science would. Time would. Mrs. Ogilvie's hair turned gray, Her husband passed away in 2008, his heart giving out, but everyone knew it was grief that killed him. He never recovered from losing Donna. He never stopped blaming himself for not being able to protect her. His funeral was small, quiet, and Mrs. Ogilvie stood at his graveside thinking about how much death had taken from her family. First Donna, then her husband. And still, no answers. But she didn't break. She couldn't afford to. She still had her other children, and they still had hope. Fragile though it was, every birthday, every anniversary of Donna's death, they gathered, they remembered, they prayed. Please, God, Mrs. Ogilvie would whisper, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes closed. Please, let there be justice. The community around Maple Leaf Park changed. New families moved in. Old ones moved away. The park was renovated. New playground equipment installed. Fresh paint on the benches. But the spot where Donna was found remained marked, in a way. Those who remembered left flowers there sometimes, small bouquets that wilted and were replaced by others, a quiet acknowledgement that something terrible had happened here and that it had not been forgotten. Detective Smith watched as new technology emerged, forensic genealogy, a method that used DNA to trace family lineages through public ancestry databases, was gaining traction. It had solved several high-profile cold cases in the United States, cases that had been dormant for decades. Smith read about these breakthroughs with growing interest. Could this work for Donna's case? Could they finally find a name to match the DNA? In 2020, he pitched the idea to his superiors. It was expensive, time-consuming, and there were no guarantees, but they approved it. The DNA sample was sent to a lab, specializing in forensic genealogy. Analysts began the painstaking process of uploading the profile to ancestry databases, searching for familial matches, building family trees that stretched across generations. Months passed. The analysts worked quietly, methodically, tracing connections that most people would never see. They found distant cousins, third and fourth removed, people who had no idea their DNA might help solve a murder. They built family trees, cross-referenced names, eliminated possibilities, and slowly, painfully slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The name surfaced in late 2024. Ronald Ackerman, 50 years old, living in a quiet suburb outside Toronto. No criminal record, no obvious connection to Donna, but the genetic genealogy pointed to him, and when investigators dug deeper, they found that he had worked in the Dufferin Street area in 1998. He had been there. He had been close. Smith felt his pulse quicken as he read the report. After 26 years, they finally had a suspect, but they needed to be sure. They couldn't arrest someone based on genetic genealogy alone. They needed a direct DNA match, so they began surveillance. Ackerman lived an unremarkable life. He went to work, came home, mowed his lawn on weekends. He had a wife, adult children who visited occasionally. To anyone watching, he was just another middle-aged man living a quiet, ordinary existence. But Smith knew better. He knew that monsters often looked like everyone else. That was how they survived. The plan was simple. They would wait for Ackerman to discard something, a coffee cup, a napkin, anything that might contain his DNA. It took 2 weeks, but finally, an officer retrieved a discarded water bottle from a trash can outside Ackerman's workplace. The bottle was sent to the lab, handled with the same care as the original evidence from 1998. The wait for results felt endless. Smith barely slept, his mind running through scenarios, possibilities. What ifs? What if it wasn't a match? What if they were wrong? What if this was just another dead end in a case full of them? But when the call came, when the lab technician said the words Smith had been waiting 26 years to hear, everything stopped. It's a perfect match. 99.9% certainty. You found him. Smith sat back in his chair, the phone still pressed to his ear, and he felt tears sting his eyes. He thought of Donna, of her family, of all the years they'd waited. He thought of Mrs. Ogilvie, still lighting candles, still praying, and he thought of the promise he'd made to himself that cold March morning. Justice delayed, but not denied. The warrants were prepared immediately. The arrest plan was set for February 11, 2025. Ackerman was scheduled to board an international flight that day, a vacation to Europe with his wife, but he would never make it onto that plane. Pearson International Airport was crowded that morning, travelers rushing to catch flights, families saying goodbye, the usual chaos of departure gates and security lines. Ronald Ackerman walked through the terminal beside his wife, pulling a suitcase, completely unaware of what was about to happen. The arrest team waited near his gate. Detective Smith stood with them, his heart pounding, his hands steady. This was it, the moment that 27 years of work had led to. He watched as Ackerman approached, watched as the man checked his watch, smiled at his wife, looked so utterly normal that it was almost impossible to believe what he'd done. When the officers moved, it happened fast. They surrounded Ackerman, their badges out, their voices firm. "Ronald Ackerman, you are under arrest for the murder of Donna Ogilvie." The words echoed through the terminal, and travelers stopped, staring, their phones already out, recording. Ackerman's face went pale. His wife screamed, confusion and horror mixing in her voice. "What? What are you talking about? There must be some mistake." But there was no mistake. The officers cuffed him, read him his rights, and led him away. He didn't resist. He didn't say a word. He just walked, his head down, his life as he knew it over. Smith watched the scene unfold, and he felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, vindication, sadness, because this moment, as important as it was, couldn't bring Donna back. It couldn't undo the decades of pain her family had endured. It could only offer them something they'd been denied for so long: the truth. The news broke within hours. Man arrested in 1998, cold case murder of Donna Ogilvie. The story spread across Toronto, across Canada, across the world. Social media exploded with reactions. People who remembered the case, people who had followed it for years, people who were just learning about it now. The consensus was unanimous. How did he get away with it for so long? Mrs. Ogilvie heard the news from Detective Smith himself. He called her from the airport, his voice gentle. "Mrs. Ogilvie, we got him. We arrested the man who killed Donna." There was silence on the other end of the line, a long, breathless silence. And then, a sob. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you." She gathered her family that evening. They sat together in the living room, the same room where they'd heard about Donna's death 27 years earlier, and they held each other, and they cried. Not just tears of grief, though those were there too, but tears of release, of finally being able to breathe after holding their breath for nearly 3 decades. "We never stopped believing," Mrs. Ogilvie said to the reporters who called, who knocked on her door, who wanted to know how she felt. "We never gave up." The public reaction was swift and intense. People who had never known Donna, who had never even heard of her before, felt connected to her story. They left flowers at Maple Leaf Park, hundreds of bouquets piling up near the spot where she was found. They posted tributes on social media, sharing her photo, telling her story, making sure she was remembered not just as a victim, but as a person, a daughter, a sister, a mother-to-be. Cold case detectives across the country reached out to Smith, asking about the methods used, the genealogy work, the breakthrough. Ackerman's DNA was compared to other unsolved cases, checking for any other connections, any other crimes that might have gone unnoticed. So far, nothing had been found, but the investigation continued, because if he'd done it once, if he'd lived with that secret for 27 years, what else might he be capable of? Smith revisited the original case files with fresh eyes. Every interview, every piece of evidence, every detail that had seemed insignificant in 1998 now took on new meaning. Had there been signs they'd missed? Had Ackerman been hiding in plain sight all along? The answers were frustrating. Yes, they'd missed him. They'd missed him because the technology didn't exist yet to find him, because he'd been lucky, because justice, sometimes, takes time. Ackerman sat in a holding cell, awaiting his preliminary hearing. He didn't speak to investigators. He didn't offer any explanation, any apology, any acknowledgement of what he'd done. His lawyer advised him to stay silent, and he did. But his silence didn't matter anymore. The DNA spoke for him. The evidence was irrefutable. Mrs. Ogilvie spent her days preparing for the trial. She wrote a victim impact statement, knowing she'd have to read it in court, knowing it would tear her apart to do so. But she would do it. She would stand up, and she would tell the court, the jury, the world, who Donna was. Not just a name in a case file, not just a statistic, but a woman who had loved and been loved, who had dreams, who had been stolen from this world far too soon. The community rallied around the family. Fundraisers were organized to help with travel costs for court appearances. Vigils were held. Support poured in from across the country, from people who understood what it meant to wait for justice, to hope against hope that someday, somehow, the truth would come to light. The preliminary hearing took place in a downtown Toronto courthouse. The building was old, grand, its hallways echoing with footsteps and whispered conversations. Media crews set up outside, their cameras trained on the entrance, waiting for glimpses of Ackerman, of the Ogilvie family, of anyone connected to the case. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the gallery, sketching artists sat with their pads, and in the front row, Mrs. Ogilvie sat with her family, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She had waited so long for this moment, and now that it was here, she felt both relief and dread, because this would mean reliving it all again, every detail, every horror. Ackerman was led in wearing a suit, his hands cuffed, his face blank. He didn't look at the family. He didn't look at anyone. He stared straight ahead as the charges were read, as the prosecutor outlined the case against him, as the defense entered a plea of not guilty. The prosecutor, Crown Counsel Lisa Warren, was meticulous. She laid out the timeline, the evidence, the DNA match. She showed photos of the crime scene, photos that made the gallery gasp, photos that Mrs. Ogilvie had to look away from. Warren spoke with authority and compassion, balancing the legal requirements with the human tragedy at the center of it all. This man, she said, pointing at Ackerman, took 2 lives on that night in March 1998, Donna Ogilvie and her unborn child. And for 27 years, he walked free while her family suffered. But today, we stand here to say, justice will be served. The defense attorney, a man named Marcus Reed, tried to poke holes in the genealogy evidence. He argued about privacy, about the reliability of familial DNA matching, about reasonable doubt, but his arguments felt thin, desperate. The direct DNA match from the water bottle was undeniable. The evidence was solid. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a measured demeanor, listened to both sides. When the arguments concluded, she set a trial date for June 2025. 4 months away. It felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Outside the courthouse, Mrs. Ogilvie spoke to the press. Her voice was steady, stronger than anyone expected. Today was hard, she said, but we will be here for every hearing, every day of the trial. We will be here because Donna deserves to have her story told. She deserves to be remembered. And she deserves justice. As the trial date approached, the prosecution built their case with care. Warren worked closely with Detective Smith, reviewing every piece of evidence, preparing witnesses, anticipating the defense's strategy. The DNA evidence was the cornerstone, but they also had circumstantial evidence: Ackerman's proximity to the crime scene, his lack of an alibi, witness statements from 1998 that, while vague, could be tied back to him now. Dr. Erin Mallory, the forensic genealogist who had cracked the case, was a key witness. She prepared to explain the science behind her work, to walk the jury through the process of tracing family trees, of narrowing down suspects, of finally arriving at Ackerman's name. She was nervous. This was her first time testifying in such a high-profile case, but she believed in the work. She believed in the truth it revealed. The Ogilvie family spent those months in a state of suspended animation. They went through the motions of daily life, work, meals, sleep, but their minds were always on the trial, on what was to come. Mrs. Ogilvie practiced reading her victim impact statement aloud, her voice breaking every time she reached the part about Donna's unborn child, about the grandchild she would never meet. Donna's sister, now in her early 40s, wrote her own statement. She talked about growing up in Donna's shadow, about how her big sister had been her hero, her protector, her best friend. She talked about the hole Donna's death had left in their family, a hole that could never be filled. We learned to live with the grief, she wrote, but we never accepted it. We never stopped fighting for her. The media coverage intensified as the trial date neared. Documentaries were commissioned. Podcasts dedicated episodes to the case. True crime enthusiasts dissected every detail, debating theories, analyzing evidence. Some criticized the delay, questioning why it had taken so long. Others defended the investigators, pointing out that they'd done everything possible with the technology available at the time. Smith gave interviews, careful to balance transparency with the need to protect the integrity of the trial. He talked about the importance of cold case units, about the advancements in forensic science, about never giving up on victims, no matter how much time had passed. Donna waited 27 years for justice, he said in one interview, but she never stopped waiting. And neither did we. Ackerman remained silent. His family, his wife, his children were in shock. They released a brief statement through their lawyer, expressing disbelief and requesting privacy. Some reports suggested his wife had filed for divorce. Others claimed she stood by him, unable to reconcile the man she knew with the man accused of murder. The truth was murky, private, and ultimately irrelevant to the case at hand. The trial began on a warm June morning. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been for the preliminary hearing. Every seat was taken, and those who couldn't get in stood outside, watching on screens that had been set up for overflow viewing. The Ogilvie family sat in their usual spot, front row, Mrs. Ogilvie between her remaining children, their hands linked. Jury selection had taken days. 12 people, ordinary citizens, who would now be asked to weigh the evidence, to decide a man's fate, to deliver justice for a woman they'd never met. They looked nervous, solemn, aware of the weight on their shoulders. Warren delivered her opening statement with precision. She walked the jury through Donna's life, her dreams, her pregnancy. She described the crime scene, the DNA evidence, the decades of investigation. She introduced them to Ackerman, not as a monster, but as an ordinary man who had done something monstrous. The evidence will show, she said, that Ronald Ackerman is responsible for Donna Ogilvie's death. The science is clear. The truth is undeniable. The defense's opening was different. Reed focused on reasonable doubt, on the limitations of genealogy evidence, on the possibility, however slim, that mistakes had been made. My client is innocent, he said, his voice firm, and we will prove that the prosecution's case is built on assumptions, not facts. The jury listened, their faces unreadable. This would be a long trial, everyone knew. Weeks, maybe longer, but Mrs. Ogilvie was ready. She had waited 27 years. She could wait a few more weeks. The first witnesses were called. The jogger who had found Donna's body, now middle-aged, testified about that morning, about the horror of stumbling upon a scene that would haunt him forever. Forensic experts explained the DNA collection process, the preservation methods, the testing procedures. Dr. Mallory took the stand and walked the jury through her work, her charts and graphs projected onto screens, her explanations clear and methodical. The courtroom was silent as she spoke. Even the defense's cross-examination couldn't shake her. She knew her work, she believed in it. And when Warren asked her, "Are you confident that the DNA found at the scene belongs to Ronald Ackerman?" she answered without hesitation. Yes, absolutely. Detective Smith testified next. He talked about the original investigation, about the dead ends, about the years of waiting. He talked about Mrs. Ogilvie, about her faith, her strength, her refusal to let her daughter be forgotten. And when Warren asked him why this case mattered so much to him, he looked directly at the jury and said, "Because every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes." The jury seemed moved. Some leaned forward, listening intently. Others took notes, their expressions thoughtful. Ackerman sat motionless, his face a mask, giving nothing away. The defense's case was weak, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. They called character witnesses, people who testified that Ackerman was a good neighbor, a reliable employee, a devoted family man. But none of that contradicted the DNA evidence. Being a good person, or appearing to be one, didn't make someone incapable of murder. Reed tried to cast doubt on the chain of custody for the DNA evidence, suggesting contamination, mishandling. But the records were meticulous. Every step had been documented, every precaution taken. The evidence was solid. They suggested mistaken identity, arguing that genealogy evidence wasn't foolproof. But the direct DNA match from the water bottle eliminated that argument. It wasn't just familial DNA, it was Ackerman's DNA, specifically, undeniably. As the trial wore on, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. The jury was being asked to send a man to prison for the rest of his life. That was no small thing, but they were also being asked to deliver justice for a woman who had been dead for 27 years, for a family that had suffered in silence for nearly 3 decades. Mrs. Ogilvie took the stand to read her victim impact statement. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the journalist stopped typing. She walked to the witness box slowly, her hands trembling, her statement clutched to her chest. When she began to read, her voice was barely above a whisper. But as she continued, it grew stronger. "Donna was my daughter," she said. "She was my light, my joy, my heart. She was kind and creative and full of dreams. She wanted to be a mother more than anything in this world, and that was taken from her by this man." She didn't look at Ackerman, she looked at the jury. "For 27 years I have grieved. For 27 years I have waited. And now, I ask you to give my daughter the justice she deserves. Please, don't let her death be forgotten. Don't let her killer walk free." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even the judge looked emotional. Warren thanked Mrs. Ogilvie quietly, gently, and helped her back to her seat, where her family embraced her. The closing arguments came next. Warren was forceful, compelling, her voice ringing through the courtroom. "The evidence is clear. Ronald Ackerman killed Donna Ogilvie. The DNA proves it. The science proves it. And now, you must prove that justice still matters, that victims still matter, that even after 27 years, the truth still matters." Reed's closing was subdued. He asked for reasonable doubt, for mercy, for consideration, but his words felt hollow, empty. The jury deliberated for 3 days, 3 long, agonizing days during which the Ogilvie family waited, prayed, hoped. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. The courtroom filled quickly, word having spread that a decision had been reached. Mrs. Ogilvie sat in her usual spot, her children on either side of her, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white. Detective Smith sat behind them, his own heart pounding. Warren and her team sat at the prosecution table, their expressions carefully neutral. Ackerman was brought in, his face still blank, still revealing nothing. The jury filed in, their faces serious, their eyes avoiding everyone in the courtroom. That was a good sign, Smith thought. Or maybe it was a bad sign. It was impossible to know. The judge asked the foreperson if they had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of first-degree murder. How do you find?" The silence was absolute. No one breathed. No one moved. Guilty. The word hung in the air for a moment, and then the courtroom erupted. Mrs. Ogilvie collapsed into her daughter's arms, sobbing, her body shaking with relief. People in the gallery gasped, some crying, some cheering. The judge called for order, but it took several minutes for the noise to die down. Ackerman's face finally showed emotion, not remorse, not regret, but shock, as if he'd truly believed he would get away with it, even now. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his head bowed, his life as he knew it over. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Mrs. Ogilvie spoke to the press one final time. Her voice was hoarse from crying, but it was steady. "Today, justice was served," she said. "It took 27 years. But Donna's killer has been held accountable. My daughter can finally rest in peace. And so can we." The reporters asked questions. Dozens of them, but she shook her head. "I've said all I need to say. Thank you. Thank you to Detective Smith, to the prosecution, to everyone who never gave up on Donna. Thank you." Smith stood beside her, his own eyes wet. "This is why we do this work," he said quietly. "For moments like this, for families like this." Justice waited, but it never left. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Ackerman was given life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. By the time he would be eligible, he'd be 75 years old. For all practical purposes, it was a life sentence. The judge's words were measured but firm. "You took, not one life, but 2. You robbed a family of their daughter, their sister, their future grandchild. You lived freely for 27 years while they suffered. This sentence reflects the gravity of your crime and the pain you have caused." Ackerman stood silently as the sentence was read. He was given the opportunity to speak, to offer some explanation, some apology, but he declined. Even at the end, he gave Donna's family nothing, no acknowledgement, no remorse. Just silence. But the family didn't need his words anymore. They had what mattered most: justice, the truth, the knowledge that Donna's killer would spend the rest of his life behind bars, that he would never hurt anyone else, that he had finally been held accountable. The community response was overwhelming. Social media flooded with tributes to Donna, with praise for Detective Smith and the cold case team, with messages of support for the Ogilvie family. True crime communities that had followed the case for years celebrated the resolution, noting it as proof that cold cases could be solved, that families should never give up hope, that science and persistence could overcome even decades of silence. Maple Leaf Park became an unofficial memorial site. The city eventually installed a small plaque near the spot where Donna was found, not marking the horror of what happened there, but celebrating her life. It read, "In memory of Donna Ogilvie and her unborn child. May their light continue to shine." People left flowers there daily, strangers and friends alike, a constant reminder that Donna had not been forgotten. Mrs. Ogilvie visited the plaque often. She would sit on a nearby bench, looking at the words, remembering her daughter's laugh, her dreams, her gentle spirit. The grief hadn't disappeared, it never would, but it had transformed into something else. Not acceptance, exactly, but peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you did everything possible, that you never gave up, that love endures even when life doesn't. Detective Smith retired 6 months after the trial. He'd spent 30 years in law enforcement, and Donna's case had defined much of his career. At his retirement party, he spoke about the importance of never giving up on victims, of using every tool available, of believing that justice, however delayed, was always worth pursuing. "Donna Ogilvie taught me that," he said. "She taught me that every case matters. Every victim deserves our best effort. And even when it seems impossible, we have to keep trying." The cold case unit continued its work, applying the same genealogy techniques to other unsolved murders. Donna's case became a blueprint, a proof of concept that these methods worked, that old evidence could yield new answers. Several other cases were solved in the following years, each one bringing closure to families who had waited just as long, who had suffered just as deeply. Dr. Erin Mallory received recognition for her work on the case. She was invited to speak at forensic science conferences, to teach courses on genetic genealogy, to help other jurisdictions set up similar programs. But she remained humble, insisting that she was just one piece of a much larger effort. "Detective Smith never gave up," she said in interviews. "The forensic team preserved the evidence perfectly. The family kept Donna's story alive. I just connected the dots. This was a team effort." The case inspired changes in how law enforcement approached cold cases. More resources were allocated to cold case units across Canada. DNA evidence from old cases was re-examined using new technology. Public ancestry databases became crucial tools in solving crimes that had once seemed unsolvable. Privacy advocates raised concerns, and legitimate debates emerged about balancing public safety with individual rights. But, for families like the Ogilvies, for victims like Donna, the technology represented hope where none had existed before. Ackerman's family remained largely silent. His wife divorced him 6 months after the conviction. His adult children struggled to reconcile the father they knew with the man who had committed such a brutal crime. One of his daughters gave a single interview, her face obscured, her voice disguised. "I don't know who my father is anymore," she said. "The man I knew would never do something like this. But the evidence doesn't lie. I grieve for Donna Ogilvie and her family, and I grieve for the father I thought I had." It was a reminder that crimes like this create ripples of pain that extend far beyond the immediate victim. Ackerman's family were innocent, yet they carried the burden of his actions. They lost their husband, their father, their sense of safety and normalcy. While their suffering couldn't compare to the Ogilvies, it was real nonetheless. The Toronto media moved on to other stories, as media always does. But occasionally, on anniversaries of the arrest or the conviction, articles would resurface, reminding people of the case, of the family's perseverance, of the importance of never giving up. Journalists like Jake Halpern, who had covered the case from the beginning, wrote follow-up pieces about how the family was healing, how they were rebuilding their lives, how they carried Donna's memory forward. Mrs. Ogilvie started a victim advocacy group, working with other families who had lost loved ones to unsolved crimes. She became a voice for those who felt forgotten, who felt like their cases didn't matter anymore. She testified before parliamentary committees about the need for better funding for cold case units, for more resources dedicated to forensic science, for victims' rights. Donna's death had taken so much from her, but she refused to let it be meaningless. She turned her grief into action, her pain into purpose. One family she helped particularly stood out, a mother whose teenage son had been killed 15 years earlier in an unsolved shooting. The woman had been on the verge of giving up, of accepting that justice would never come. But Mrs. Ogilvie sat with her, held her hand and said, "Don't stop believing. I waited 27 years. Your time will come too." And 2 years later, it did. New evidence led to an arrest. The mother called Mrs. Ogilvie immediately, sobbing with gratitude. "You were right," she said. "You were right." Donna's sister found healing in art. She began painting portraits of her sister, capturing different moments from their childhood, from happier times. The paintings were beautiful, full of light and color, depicting Donna laughing, Donna dancing, Donna with her hand on her pregnant belly, dreaming of the future. She exhibited them in a small Toronto gallery, and the opening was packed with people who had followed the case, who wanted to see Donna not as a victim but as a person, vibrant and alive. One painting in particular drew attention. It showed Donna holding a baby, even though she'd never gotten the chance to do so in life. Her sister explained the piece in an artist's statement. "This is the life my sister should have had, the moment that was stolen from her. I painted it so we could all see what could have been, what should have been. It's my way of giving her that moment, even if only on canvas." The painting sold for a significant amount, and the proceeds went to a scholarship fund, established in Donna's name. The scholarship supported young women pursuing careers in healthcare, reflecting Donna's own dream of becoming a nurse before she died. Every year, a recipient was chosen, and every year, Mrs. Ogilvie presented the award personally, telling the winner about her daughter, about her kindness and her dreams. The years continued to pass. 2026, 2027. The sharp edges of grief softened, though they never disappeared entirely. The Ogilvie family found ways to remember Donna that brought them joy instead of just pain. They celebrated her birthday with cake, the kind she used to love, and they told stories about her that made them laugh. They visited Maple Leaf Park not just to mourn, but to sit in the sunshine and remember the good times, the moments before everything changed. Detective Smith stayed in touch with the family, visiting occasionally, checking in to see how they were doing. The bond forged through their shared pursuit of justice had become something deeper, a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and understanding. When Smith's own father passed away, Ogilvie attended the funeral, returning the support he had shown her family for so many years. The cold case unit solved 14 more murders, using genetic genealogy in the years following Donna's case. Each one brought closure to families who had been waiting, hoping, praying. Each one proved that the methods worked, that persistence mattered, that old cases weren't hopeless. Detective units around the world took notice, implementing similar programs, achieving similar results. Donna's case became cited in textbooks, in training manuals, in academic papers about forensic science. Her death, tragic as it was, had helped change how law enforcement approached cold cases forever. Ackerman remained in prison, a forgotten man serving out his sentence in silence. He gave no interviews. He expressed no remorse. He simply existed, a shadow of who he'd once been, spending his days in a cell, knowing he would likely die there. Some people said he deserved worse. Others argued that life in prison was punishment enough. But for the Ogilvie family, what mattered wasn't his suffering. It was knowing he could never hurt anyone else, that Donna's death had been acknowledged, that the truth had been told. On the 30th anniversary of Donna's death, the family organized a special vigil at Maple Leaf Park. They expected maybe 50 people to attend, close friends, some journalists, perhaps a few members of the community who still remembered. Instead, hundreds came. People who had followed the case online, who had been inspired by the family's perseverance, who wanted to pay their respects to a woman they'd never met, but whose story had touched them deeply. Mrs. Ogilvie stood before the crowd, now in her 70s, her hair completely white, her face lined with years of grief and survival, but her voice was strong as she spoke. 30 years ago, my daughter was taken from us. For 27 of those years, we didn't know who was responsible. We lived with questions that had no answers, with grief that had no resolution. But we never stopped believing that justice would come. She paused, looking around at the sea of candles flickering in the evening light. Today, I want to thank every person who never forgot Donna. Every detective who worked her case, every forensic scientist who preserved and analyzed the evidence, every journalist who kept her story alive, every stranger who left flowers or said a prayer. You all helped us get through the darkest days. You all reminded us that we weren't alone. Her voice wavered slightly, but she continued. Donna would be 54 years old now if she'd lived. She'd probably be a grandmother herself. She'd be living the life she dreamed about all those years ago. We can't give her that life back, but we can make sure she's remembered. We can make sure her story means something. We can make sure that other families fighting for justice know there's hope. The crowd was silent, except for quiet sniffles, people wiping away tears. Mrs. Ogilvie's remaining children stood beside her, their arms around their mother. A family that had been broken but never shattered, wounded but never defeated. A young woman stepped forward from the crowd, a college student holding a bouquet of yellow roses. Mrs. Ogilvie, she said softly, I'm a scholarship recipient. I'm studying to be a nurse because of Donna's legacy. I just wanted to thank you, and to tell you that I'll carry her story with me always. I'll make sure her name lives on. Mrs. Ogilvie embraced the young woman, tears streaming down both their faces. It was a moment of pure connection, of understanding that pain can be transformed into purpose, that loss can become legacy, that even in the darkest tragedies, light can somehow find a way through. The vigil ended with a moment of silence, hundreds of people standing together in the park where Donna's life had ended, honoring not just her memory, but the enduring power of love, of faith, of refusing to give up, even when all seems lost. As the candles were extinguished one by one, people didn't leave immediately. They lingered, talking quietly, sharing their own stories of loss and healing, of cases solved and justice served, of the importance of remembering, of never letting the forgotten stay forgotten. In the years that followed, Mrs. Ogilvie's health began to decline. Age and decades of grief had taken their toll, but she faced it with the same strength she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. She spent her final years surrounded by family, telling stories about Donna, making sure her grandchildren, who had never met their aunt, knew who she was, what she valued, what she'd dreamed of becoming. On a quiet afternoon in 2029, Mrs. Ogilvie passed away peacefully in her sleep, her children at her bedside. She was 76 years old. At her funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives she'd touched, other victims' families she'd advocated for, detectives who had worked Donna's case, journalists who had covered the story, scholarship recipients who had benefited from Donna's legacy, and countless community members who had watched her fight for justice and been inspired by her strength. Detective Smith, now elderly himself, delivered a eulogy. His voice trembled as he spoke. I met Mrs. Ogilvie on the worst day of her life, the day she learned her daughter had been murdered, and I watched her, over the next 30 years, transform that devastating loss into something extraordinary. She never gave up. She never lost faith, and she never let Donna be forgotten. She showed me what true strength looks like, what true love looks like, what true justice looks like. He paused, gathering himself. When we finally arrested Ronald Ackerman, when justice was finally served, I thought that would be the end of the story. But Mrs. Ogilvie taught me it was just the beginning. Because justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, it's about honoring the innocent. It's about remembering. It's about making sure that tragedy doesn't have the final word. Mrs. Ogilvie was buried next to her husband, and not far from where Donna's ashes had been interred decades earlier. The headstone was simple but meaningful: loving mother, fierce advocate, keeper of faith. Beneath those words were two dates, and between them, a lifetime of love and loss, and ultimately, peace. The victim advocacy group she'd founded continued its work, now run by her daughter. The scholarship fund continued to support young women pursuing careers in healthcare. The memorial at Maple Leaf Park remained a place where people came to remember, to reflect, to find solace. Donna's story, and her mother's story, lived on, testaments to the enduring power of love to transcend even death. The cold case unit in Toronto kept a photo in their office, not of the arrest, not of the trial, but of Mrs. Ogilvie and her family at one of the early vigils, holding candles, their faces etched with determination. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Never give up, never stop believing. Justice delayed is not justice denied." It served as a reminder to every detective who worked there, every case they pursued, every family they served. Some investigations take time. Some answers come slowly, but persistence matters, faith matters, and every victim, no matter how long they've waited, deserves justice. Ronald Ackerman died in prison in 2032 at the age of 77. He had served 7 years of his life sentence. There was no fanfare, no media coverage, no public mourning. He died as he'd lived after his arrest in silence, his secrets kept even to the end. Some of his family attended a small, private funeral, others did not. His name faded from public consciousness quickly, remembered only as a footnote in Donna's story, which is exactly as it should have been. The true legacy belonged to Donna, to her family, to the detectives and scientists who never gave up, to the community that rallied around them. In 2035, on what would have been Donna's 60th birthday, a documentary was released chronicling the entire case from beginning to end. It featured interviews with Detective Smith, with Dr. Mallory, with Donna's sister, with prosecutors and forensic experts. But most powerfully, it featured footage of Mrs. Ogilvie, recorded before her death, telling Donna's story in her own words. "My daughter was more than a victim," she said in the documentary's final moments. "She was a person. She had dreams and fears and quirks and habits that made her uniquely her. She loved chocolate ice cream and old movies. She sang off-key but with enthusiasm. She gave the best hugs. She was going to name her baby Hope if it was a girl, James if it was a boy. These are the things I want people to remember. Not just how she died, but how she lived." The documentary won awards and was viewed by millions. It sparked conversations about cold cases, about victims' rights, about the importance of forensic science, about never giving up on justice. It inspired other families to keep fighting for their loved ones. It inspired young people to pursue careers in law enforcement and forensic science. It inspired communities to support one another through tragedy. Donna's sister continued creating art, each piece a tribute not just to Donna but to all victims of unsolved crimes, all families waiting for answers, all people who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. Her work was exhibited internationally, and she spoke at events about using creativity to process grief, about finding beauty even in the darkest stories, about the healing power of remembrance. The scholarship fund in Donna's name had, by 2035, supported over 50 young women in their educational pursuits. Many of them went on to become nurses, doctors, social workers, advocates, people who dedicated their lives to helping others, embodying the spirit of kindness and care that Donna herself had shown. Each year, at the scholarship ceremony, recipients learned Donna's story, understood the legacy they were carrying forward, and committed to living with the same compassion and determination she'd shown. Maple Leaf Park underwent renovations in 2036, but the memorial to Donna remained, carefully preserved and even enhanced. A small garden was planted around it, with flowers that bloomed year-round, tended by community volunteers who had never met Donna, but felt connected to her story. Visitors often left notes at the memorial, sharing their own experiences with loss, with waiting for justice, with finding strength in impossible circumstances. Detective Smith passed away in 2038, at the age of 82. He had lived long enough to see Donna's case become a landmark example of cold case investigation, to see genetic genealogy become standard practice, to see countless other families receive the closure the Ogilvies had fought so hard to achieve. At his funeral, representatives from police departments across Canada attended, paying respects to a man who had embodied the best of law enforcement: patience, dedication, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to justice. His family donated his personal files on Donna's case to a museum dedicated to forensic science and criminal justice, where they became part of an educational exhibit teaching future generations about the evolution of investigative techniques. Students and professionals studied the case, learned from it, were inspired by it. Smith's methods, his meticulous note-taking, his refusal to give up, became teaching models. The exhibit included not just documents and evidence, but also personal items that humanized everyone involved. Donna's ultrasound photo, Mrs. Ogilvie's handwritten victim impact statement, Smith's badge and the photo of Donna he'd kept on his desk for 30 years, Dr. Mallory's genealogy charts, the discarded water bottle that had finally cracked the case. Each artifact told part of the story, and together they created a powerful narrative about persistence, about science, about the human capacity for both terrible evil and extraordinary good. Visitors to the exhibit often left emotional, moved by the story, inspired by the perseverance, grateful for the reminder that justice, however delayed, still matters. School groups toured it, learning not just about forensic techniques but about empathy, about the importance of every life, about seeing beyond statistics and case numbers to the real people affected by crime. It became one of the most visited exhibits, a testament to how deeply Donna's story resonated with people. By 2040, genetic genealogy had helped solve hundreds of cold cases across North America and beyond. The technique that had seemed revolutionary in 2024 was now standard procedure. But Donna's case remained one of the most cited, one of the most studied, one of the most remembered, because it wasn't just about the science. It was about the family who never gave up, the detective who kept his promise, the community that rallied together, and the victim who, even in death, had changed the world. Donna's sister, now in her 60s, continued her advocacy work, speaking at conferences about victim support, about the long-term impacts of unresolved cases, about the healing power of justice even when it comes late. She wrote a memoir about growing up with Donna, losing her, and eventually finding peace. The book became a bestseller, its proceeds funding expansion of the scholarship program and supporting other victims' families. In the memoir's acknowledgments, she wrote, "To my sister Donna, who deserved so much more than she received, you were taken too soon, but your light has never dimmed. Every life touched by your story, every case solved using the methods pioneered in your investigation, every family who finds closure, that's your legacy. You are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten." The story of Donna Ogilvie, her murder, the decades-long wait for justice, and the eventual resolution became woven into Toronto's collective memory. It was mentioned in news stories about other cold cases. It was referenced in discussions about forensic technology. It was taught in criminology courses. It was shared on podcasts and in documentaries. It lived on in the hearts of those who had known Donna, in the work of those inspired by her family's perseverance, in the policies and procedures changed because of her case. On the 50th anniversary of her death in 2048, a new generation gathered at Maple Leaf Park. Most of them had been born long after Donna died, but they knew her story. They understood its significance. They came to honor her memory and to reaffirm the values her case represented, that every life matters, that justice should never expire, that families deserve answers, that communities must support one another, that patience and persistence can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. The mayor of Toronto spoke at the anniversary vigil. 50 years ago, this city lost one of its own, in a senseless act of violence. For 27 of those years, her killer walked free while her family suffered, but they never gave up, they never stopped believing, and eventually, justice was served. Donna Ogilvie's story reminds us that we must never accept unsolved crimes as inevitable. We must never treat victims as statistics. We must never forget that behind every case number is a person, a family, a community forever changed. The vigil ended as it had for 50 years, with candles lit in silence, with prayers whispered into the night, with flowers laid at the memorial. As the crowd dispersed, an elderly woman remained behind, kneeling at the memorial, her fingers tracing Donna's name on the plaque. She was a scholarship recipient from 20 years earlier, now a respected trauma nurse, and she came to this spot every year to pay her respects, to remember the woman whose legacy had made her career possible. "Thank you, Donna," she whispered, "for inspiring me, for reminding me why I do this work, for showing me that even in the darkest moments, there can be light." And there, in that park, where horror had once reigned, where grief had been so profound, it seemed insurmountable, there was indeed light, in the candles, in the flowers, in the stories shared, and the memories kept, in the knowledge that justice, though it had waited 27 years, had finally, decisively, been served. In the quiet, after the vigil, as the park returned to its peaceful state, one truth remained undeniable. Donna Ogilvie had not died in vain. Her death had sparked a revolution in cold case investigation. Her family's perseverance had inspired countless others. Her memory had become a beacon for those fighting their own battles for justice. And her legacy of compassion, of hope, of the unbreakable bond between love and justice, would endure long after everyone who had known her personally was gone. Justice waited, but it never left.